Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Golden Sovereign, Bubber's Tale. Bubber was working in his field as usual in the early spring, hoeing new rows for planting. As usual, his mind was far away as he dreamed of how much happier he would be raising cattle. The only problem was that cattle were expensive, and Bubber was literally dirt poor. He often daydreamed of an unexpected windfall, such as a treasure buried in his field, or even a visit from good King Levius, who was known for his generosity to the poor. His fantasies would have been harmless had they not interfered with his level of effort on his daily tasks. As it was, he could barely afford to pay his rent to Farmer Perfidios. Now, Farmer Perfidios had some amazing cattle, Bubber thought. What I wouldn't give for Farmer Perfidios' prize bull. Good horses, too, like the ones Di used to teach me to ride. Bubber's holding was at the far end of Farmer Perfidios' farmstead, and a finger of the southeastern region of the thicket encroached on the small patch of land where his hovel stood. It was called the thicket because in some places the growth was so dense that nothing larger than a very small and tenacious insect could negotiate the plant wall. Within the thicket there were open spaces, but most of it was large and looming trees. The few who returned from its depths invariably reported that they had become disoriented within its depths. Even experienced foresters would sometimes be lost once they penetrated beyond the first mile of the great forest, and it covered many miles. As Bubber finished the row he was hoeing, he looked up and realized that the sun would soon set. He was about to start one last row. The last row is always the hardest to hoe, he thought wistfully. Suddenly he felt that prickly feeling, as though someone was watching him. He looked towards where the looming eaves of the thicket grew adjacent to his small holdings, and noticed a figure standing at the verge of the midst of early blooming ladybell and fairy paintbrush flowers. The figure appeared to be an old man bent in gray. The man was leaning heavily on a staff. His voluminous cloak was tattered and worn, patched to the point where Bubber could not tell the original material from the patches. Bubber waved at the man and started walking towards him. He'd take any way out of more hoeing. As Bubber approached the old man, he noticed that beneath the fellow's rags he appeared very thin. Bubber grinned and greeted the old man. "How do and welcome, friend. I'm called Bubber. How are you called?" The old man returned Bubber's smile and said in a muted, age-softened voice, "I am called Seeker." Seeker's eyes were bright and mischievous, despite his frail appearance. "Welcome to my holding, friend Seeker," stated Bubber. "Maybe you'd like to share my fire and my food, meager though they may be. I would welcome any news of the world as well." Bubber was always hungry for news. He was also unusually hungry, period. However, he had been raised to be polite and generous. It would never have occurred to Bubber to do anything less than provide his last morsel to a stranger in need. His mother had beaten that value into him from his earliest years. Seeker nodded his acceptance and started hobbling towards Bubber's hovel. As he moved, he seemed to need his staff less than Bubber had originally assumed. Bubber carefully put away his hoeing tool on a hook on the side of his hovel. Bubber did not particularly relish being a dirt grubber, but his father had beaten into him the concept that if he failed to care for his tools, they would not serve when he needed them, and he would end up even hungrier. Seeker stopped just over the threshold. There was only one stool in the room hut. Bubber indicated the seat with his broad, calloused hands and says, "Please, friend Seeker, take the stool." I must prepare some food, and you are weary from the road. Please take some water. I'm sorry I have nothing better, but the water is cold and fresh from the stream." The water wasn't all that fresh, but it had remained cold, and Bubber did not intentionally mislead his guest. He was merely distracted by his hunger and his desire to hear what news his guest might possess. Bubber placed the better of his 2 cups before the old man and then began preparing the evening meal. Bubber was reasonably tall and had a tendency to stoop his broad shoulders as he shuffled about his hut. He did not take long to prepare supper, since he had little to prepare. He stirred up the fire and placed the last of the thick sticks which passed for his hearth logs into the flame. The air was chilly in the early spring evening, so even the small blaze was welcome. He placed half of his flat, brown bread and the last chunk of his cheese on the tree stump that was his table. His father had built the hut around the stump and had worked diligently to smooth the top into a table surface. Da had constructed the hovel from the remnants of old Wagian caravan trailer wagon in which the floor had rotted away, to leave only the upper portion of the structure. The wheel still leaned against the sides as decoration. Poor old Da, he thought, died young, kicked in the head by Farmer Perfidio's mare, and after surviving the big war with potassium and them other countries. "Please eat, friend Seeker, eat," Bubber urged his guest. Seeker obliged quite heartily. Bubber took out his last dried apple and gave it to Seeker. He noticed that Seeker had very good teeth for an old and destitute man. Bubber refilled the old man's cup several times, all the while begging forgiveness for the plain and meager fare. Bubber wanted desperately to hear tales of the road, but was too polite to ask before his guest had finished eating. At last the old man finished his meal. Bubber thought that he had taken an inordinately long amount of time to consume so little, as though he'd stopped to savor every bite. He leaned towards Bubber, and Bubber sat on the floor and loomed, his lean bulk blocking much of the heat and fire from his tiny hearth. Seeker began telling him various happenings from the capital, all the way down to local villages. As he told his tales, Bubber failed to note that Seeker's voice became stronger, and that he spoke more clearly. Bubber was focused on the far away and on the visions created by Seeker's melodic voice and manner. "Friend Bubber, you would be amazed at the capital. Magnesium, the buildings, they arise towards the sky in layers, often as many as 6. There is always excitement around every corner, and the city never sleeps. The people are always restless. Of course, they have no love of taxes or of the poor who choke the avenues with their numbers. Many claim that their taxes should not support the poor masses, and that the reason so many are crowded into the city is because of the king's generous dole. They whine about payments to barbarian tribesmen to keep them at bay, and claim that the funds would be better spent on soldiers and equipment to fight the scourges. They would have the king send the sons of Magnesium into battle and risk our precious youth. Those claims are treason." At this point, Seeker spoke with such passion that he rose slightly from Bubber's stool. However, his passion faded quickly, and he shortly resumed his seat and his calm demeanor. "You would enjoy a sojourn in Magnesium. Your patch of land is far from the populace of even the little village down the pathway, Creekside, I believe it was called." Bubber nodded, his mouth slightly agape as Seeker continued. "I am called Seeker because I seek out those who are true of heart and loyal to the king and the kingdom. Such folk deserve to be recognized, and I do so in my humble way." Seeker grinned in a none too humble manner. "I have traveled a long path in search of fidelity. I was in the big war, and saw the minions of the evil Potassium vanquished. I even traveled beyond the kingdom, as far as midsummer. They race one another to the tops of the trees like the giant squirrels that inhabit their forest. They stand on logs in the water and run as the logs spin to see who can do so the longest, like the enormous beavers that inhabit their streams and lakes. They even walk out on logs suspended on the air on ropes, and they fight with staves until one of them is proclaimed King of the Air. Bubber did not want to interrupt to ask what a beaver was, much less a giant one. He imagined that it was some type of fish or slimy aquatic creature, or maybe something like a flat-tailed water rats that dam the local creeks and gnawed on trees. However, the giant squirrels sounded tasty. He occasionally dined on their smaller cousins that strayed from the safety of the branches of the thicket, and those were significantly larger than the ones from the regular patches of wood in the area. Seeker continued, ignoring Bubber's ignorance. At midwinter, they strap metal blades to their shoes and glide across frozen lakes. They struggle in a game that involves fighting with sticks while trying to remain upright on the ice, and to toss leather balls into slings that hang from the sticks. They also strap flat pieces of wood to their feet and slide across the snow on long journeys. They even race downhill from the high mountains on little boards. Many are injured or even die when they collide with trees or fall in crevices, but it is considered an honor among them to win these races. I never made it to the northwest portion of the thicket, but I heard tales of strange creatures among the big stony mountains. Some tell of wild beastmen called bearkin. They walk upright and speak after a fashion, but in other aspects are more alike to wild bears that inhabit that region than to men. Those mountains are full of gnomon, a small folk who delve deep into the earth and stones in search of ores and gems. They were wonderful crafters and very clever in their dealings, though also very secretive. Of course, we know them since there are artifacts in the royal city of Magnesium. Everyone says they are gnomon-made. As you may know, no one goes to the southwest beyond the great saline lake, except at need, in the extreme southwest beyond the lake. The thicket comes against the seared mountains, beyond which lies the calophytes of Sanzones. The caliphate is home to a fierce people whose hair is the color of dried blood or rust, and whose skin is burned where it is not painted or scarred by their mysterious rituals. They are fiercely loyal to a single god, Krakun, who we style as the adversary, and an ancient prophet, Sanzones, of whom little is now known in our land. They only allow a limited number of infidel traders and diplomats into their territories. We heard that the Sanzones practice many strange rites, including whirling dances and constant prayers, and that they face hideous creatures from the seared mountains on one hand, pirates who cross the fertile coastal plains to their west, and deserts to their south, and beyond where lies the Republic of the Remans. Everyone says that the Sanzones are harsh and wicked people in a harsh and twisted land. We do not travel that way, for who could find righteousness among such creatures? Bubber nodded politely, as though he completely understood what he was told. In the deep-soaked lands to our southeast, near the mouth of the big muddy river, we face Althesians and Meerkatsins, and beings that keep us from developing ports in that area. Throughout our journey, we faced Saracha, Doshan, and all manner of Ephraim. The thicket contains monsters of all sorts, as everybody knows. Bubber didn't notice the change from I to we, nor did he feel the need to ask why Seeker believed Such incredible tales told by strangers. He had heard of Sriracha and Dowson. They were monsters conjured to frighten small children into obedience, though perhaps they could be found in the depths of the thicket. Many fantastic beings dwelt in the green depths. Everyone said so. Who knew what other beings might exist in the wide world? He knew that there were many. Everybody knew that. He did not think about why Seeker would have to visit so many other realms, or why he would have sought honest and true men in the wilds where there were more settled lands to the east, not to mention the very kingdom of magnesium, of which Creekside was a part. On the other hand, everyone knew that Easterners were dishonest, so why bother? He considered the word infrina to be in bad taste. The local preachers of the various religions had beaten that lesson into him at an early age. Most polite folk referred to them, if at all, as minions of the adversary, or simply minions. In Bubber's part of the world, people had forgotten that infrina was simply part of an older language of the elder folk, whose home world this was, and that it meant minions of the adversary. Seeker continued, ignoring the cogitations inside the brain of his lanky host. There were gigantic beasts that roamed the soaked lands, buoyed by the shallow streams and by the bayous dug by Soaklanders. We visited that freewheeling folk and heard them pick out songs of joy on their stringed instruments, all in despite of their dangerous and often dreary environment. We chose not to cross the big muddy river into the Gotchian realms. After all, Easterners are not to be trusted. Bubber absently nodded his agreement. The denizens of Potassium are still unfriendly after their loss to us in the big war, so there was nowhere to seek nearby. Bubber's father had always said that the big war was a waste, a stalemate that left many dead with no real gain for either kingdom. He said that the leaders of both sides were better at checkers than chess. Bubber wasn't sure what all chess involved, but it sounded complicated, though Daw had taught him checkers. Of course, Daw could never have met anyone as fascinating as Seeker, unless, of course, they served together in the big war. He'd have to ask about that if he had the chance. Seeker continued speaking through Bubber's mental fog, but eventually he slumped on the stool and took a pensive air. Now I feel the need to return to magnesium. The road has left me weary, and my search has been, for the most part, fruitless. I fear that few will love good King Lavius, and none in foreign lands will follow a philosophy such as his, no matter that he supports the poor, even those who once fought against us in the big war, or who are from less fortunate lands, and who are now welcomed and fed. One would think that those taxed would be happy to have their fruits of their labor distributed equally among all. Indeed, only the mobs of the poor are left to support the king. At this point, Seeker should have begun to sag even further, but he spoke on into the night until his voice softened once again and began to grow hoarse. Bubber avidly absorbed every word. He had always wanted to travel and just knew that he would someday, despite the absurd and fantastic tales Seeker had spun. He knew that there had to be some interesting happenings in the wild world. Certainly more than people gliding down snowy hills on flat sticks. Then, with a start, he realized he was being a poor host. His granny had beaten better manners into him in this regard. "I'm so sorry, good Seeker. I keep you from your rest." Bubber apologized to his guest. The old man waved away Bubber's apology. "All is well, friend Bubber. I merely wanted to pay you fairly for the meal. and I rarely find such a courteous listener for my tales." Bubber blushed and looked towards his feet. He knew that the meal had been pretty plain fare, even with someone with such appalling clothing as the seeker. Bubber insisted that the seeker take his own narrow-strap cot. He also provided his best blanket to the older man. Bubber made do with a straw mat his mother had woven before she was taken by the foreign flux. A few years passed. He rolled up in his other blanket, which had a few holes but was still serviceable. As Bubber attempted to fall asleep, he stared into the flames, looking at the side of his small hearth. Really not much more than a shallow pit with a few stones set around it, in the dirt floor and a small clay funnel above it, to draw the smoke out from the sidewall, and imagine his own future travels. He was genuinely appreciative that the old man had spoken so freely, though he doubted some of the information. He eventually tossed and turned his way into a fitful, dream-filled slumber, the one place where he could travel and experience triumphal adventures without having to expend any physical effort. Bubber awakened later than usual. He could see through the cracks around his doorway that the sun was already in the sky. Seeker was still snoring lightly, wrapped in his ragged cloak and Bubber's best blanket. Bubber stirred up the coals of the fire, then took his bucket and filled it at the same stream. He heated his remaining bread over embers of the fire and scourged half a dollop of honey from his clay jar. He looked ruefully at the place where he normally stored his firewood. "That's the last of the allotment for this month," he thought with a shiver. "Same as the honey and apples. Oh well, the stories of the world were worth it, and tonight I'll have both blankets." It wouldn't have occurred to Bubber to seek more firewood deeper inside the thicket, at least without properly paying homage to the spirit of the forest, whom some call the Green Man. The thicket was full of all sorts of mythical beasts and monsters. Everyone said so, including his master, Farmer Perfidios, so it must be true. Bubber had on many occasions spied a large, shadowy cat that haunted the edge of the thicket. He left scraps for her on the rare occasion when he had them, and never wondered why he knew the cat was a female. She never came close that he saw, but the scraps were invariably gone the following morning. She usually visited near dark, and he would catch only a glimpse. She was very large and very black, and deathly silent in her ranging. She must have been of supernatural origin, so Bubber wanted to keep her content. He shivered as he thought of the cat's eyes. He had seen them once, shining from the murk of the thicket. He heard a noise. Seeker was now stirring. He opened his eyes, sat up, and stretched grandly, nodding good morning to Bubber, and then stepped outside for a moment. By the time he returned, Bubber had set the bread and honey on the table with a cup of water. Seeker ate his breakfast in silence, grasping his cloak of patches with one hand. Bubber ate plain bread and drank from his old leaky, waxed leather cup. He knew he should have started work an hour ago, but it would be rude to leave my guest, wouldn't it? Seeker finished the last of Bubber's bread, and then looked Bubber in the eye. Seeker asked in a very direct and serious tone, "Bubber, what are your dreams for the future?" Bubber was normally self-conscious, but under Seeker's insistent gaze, he began describing his fondest hopes. "I wish one day to raise cattle. I want to drive them to the market at Doltari. I could start with just a bull and 2 or 3 cows. From there I would build a fine herd. I'm good with cattle and can ride a horse. Farmer Perfidios has me drive his cattle to the fair in Doltari each year, though he doesn't let me attend the bargaining or the revelry. He says that with my bovine features, I look like one of the cattle." Bubber paused for a moment and looked at the floor. He knew that some resentment had crept into his tone. He didn't want to say anything ill of his master. Farmer Perfidios's bullies had beaten that assumed courtesy into him in recent years. He discovered and quickly continued, "One day I hope to have my own herd to drive, so I can feed the masses as we are told to do by good King Levius." Bubber paused to take a drink, more to keep the fluid from leaking onto his clothes than from any real thirst. Seeker leaned forward and said in a much stronger voice, "So you support the king's belief that we should feed those less fortunate than ourselves?" Before Bubber could answer, Seeker continued, "I can see that you follow the king's teachings by your kindness to me. Despite my rags and your loyal statement about the crown, you have earned a great reward." Bubber sat quietly, for he had no response. He pondered in his methodical way. "Of course I support good King Levius. If not, he would have me beaten or worse. Why does the Seeker sound so surprised? What great reward could such a desperate old man produce anyway? Do you think this would buy a bull, a few cows, and a plot of land?" As he spoke, Seeker put forth a massive golden disc from under his robes. He had to hold it with both hands because of the tremendous size and weight of the disc. Bubber's jaw dropped in amazement, displaying his poorly maintained, though still sound, teeth. He stared at the disc and attempted to process what it was. It had to be, but it could not be, a golden sovereign. Golden sovereigns were called so because they were only minted by permission of the king himself to pay large national debts. One side was stamped with a starburst and the other with an image of the crown of the kings of magnesium. At last Bubber stammered, Is it real?" Seeker smiled and said, "From the king's own hand," and placed the giant coin on Bubber's stump table. Bubber sat stunned, staring at the amazing coin. Seeker commented that he had failed to penetrate his thick brow. Seeker rose majestically from the stool, threw off the tattered cloak to which he had clung during breakfast. The clothing revealed was of the highest quality. Bubber could now see that Seeker was wearing an embroidered tunic, finely woven hosen, and soft leather boots. His ragged cloak had dragged the ground before, concealing his feet. Bubber's jaw fell open and his eyes bulged as he gaped in surprise. He just sat staring until he noticed the expression on Seeker's face start to turn from a look of triumph to a hearty glower. Before the transformation was fairly begun, Bubber quickly fell to both knees and placed his hands over his heart. He averted his gaze to the floor. It didn't take him long to adjust from astonishment to supplication. The men who levied the royal taxes had beaten the lesson of obedience into Bubber and his fellows. Then he breathed, "You are good King Levius himself." "Indeed," said the now revealed monarch. "I have wandered far, searching for a good and loyal subject, or even a foreigner deserving this reward. I had begun to fear I would not find such a man before the spring rains began, and I had to return to magnesium. I never thought to find what I sought so close to home and in my very own lands. I am proud to have you as a subject, friend Bubber. Now, arise, Squire Bubber." Bubber pinched himself. Sure, he must be dreaming. This was a story right out of legend. The king assured him that he was not dreaming, and with slight annoyance, gestured that Bubber really should rise and get on with it. "I must return swiftly, for there is much for a king to do, and I have been away for over a year. When you have your horse and cattle on your land, come to see me at magnesium, and I will make your appointment as royal squire official." As the king spoke, he hustled Bubber out of the doorway of the hovel and towards the shadows of the thicket. Once under the trees, with the green filtered sunlight gleaming above, The king took forth a small, silver hunting horn from the bundle of rags he now carried. He blew 3 clear, sharp notes. Bubber was amazed when shortly thereafter, well-accoutred riders emerged from the trees. One of the men was leading an exquisite white stallion. The king mounted the steed, now appearing quite spry and vigorous, though to Bubber's thinking, still too thin for a healthy monarch. He waved to Bubber, wishing him well, and turned the magnificent beast towards the trail, leading from Bubber's hovel towards the road to Doltari, the nearest township, and from there to lands far and away. Bubber started to wave, then remembered himself and bowed. Then he cheered good King Levius on his way. It never occurred to Bubber, nor apparently to the king, that one young peasant yelling and clapping and whistling was hardly resounding support from the local subjects. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.